preface this with a couple of facts about prevalence. So it's interesting that most people who experience trauma actually don't go on to develop PTSD. I think it's 30 to 50% of people who experience some kind of trauma-related symptoms in the month or two after they experience a trauma. And then of those, I think about half of them go on to develop chronic PTSD. So when you think about it, it's actually a minority of people who actually develop PTSD. But some vulnerability factors that have been talked about in the literature are things like exposure to previous traumas. So people who have experienced more trauma in the past are more likely to develop PTSD in the future. Severity and intensity of the trauma. So people who experience more severe traumas are more likely to develop PTSD. I think that there's some evidence that women and children are more likely to develop PTSD if they experience trauma. People who have a family history of psychiatric illness of some sort are more vulnerable. People who've had more stressful life events over the course of their lives, and certainly at the time of the trauma, are more vulnerable as well. As I mentioned before, this rigid belief system is also a vulnerability factor. So people who have this intense belief in a just world, that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, they're more vulnerable. People who have less social support. So folks who are able to connect with others in their lives, process the trauma, talk about it, make sense of it, are less likely to develop PTSD after a trauma. And then I think just general coping skills, people who have more coping strategies at their disposal, whether that's having a good support system or being able to connect with their values and things that are important to them in the wake of a trauma, are less likely to develop PTSD. I think whether we recognize it or not, most of us are taught to believe in a just, benevolent, predictable world. And I think this is very much embedded in our culture. Like we're taught this through church, in grade school, oftentimes by our parents or adults who are shaping us as we grow. And trauma is by its very nature unpredictable and shocking. And so it violates many of our beliefs and worldviews that the world is just, good, and predictable. So often people with trauma will have these worldviews completely shifted. Like I've been working with a lot of clients who pre-trauma would say, I felt really confident and like I could trust in my judgment. And then after trauma, I would say, I can't trust myself at all. I feel I can't rely on my judgments. Often people with trauma will say, I feel like I can trust people. They could say that before the trauma, and then afterwards would say, others aren't trustworthy. I really can't rely on other people in my life. Pre-trauma, a lot of people will say that the world is safe and good. And after the trauma, they might say that it's dangerous and unsafe. So these negative beliefs that people have or develop after a trauma often help to maintain the trauma symptoms afterwards because they feel like they can't really trust anyone in their lives, can't trust themselves, and believe that the world is a dangerous place. And they don't feel safe in it. There's some evidence I was looking at recently that shows that people who have more flexible worldviews or belief systems are less vulnerable to developing PTSD than people who have more rigid belief systems or worldviews. And I think the whole idea here is that the people with more flexible belief systems can more flexibly incorporate or accommodate the trauma into their belief structure rather than having the trauma completely shatter their belief systems. So that's one thing that helps to maintain the PTSD. The other thing is avoidance. So people with trauma often avoid thoughts, memories, and emotions related to the traumatic experience. And then they often avoid people, places, situations, or things that remind them of the trauma. And so what this does is it helps to constrain their world and makes their lives smaller and smaller and smaller. And they don't get that kind of corrective feedback from being able to go out in the world and realize, actually, the world is pretty safe. Actually, I'm competent and able to trust my judgment, and I'm able to forge relationships so I can trust other people. So those are the two main things, the negative belief systems and the avoidance.
With that in mind, how do cognitive behavioral therapists treat people for PTSD?
As I was mentioning, avoidance is kind of the glue that holds these PTSD symptoms together. whether that's avoidance of activities, places, people, or things, or avoidance of trauma memories, reminders, emotions. And so all of the PTSD treatments, whether it's prolonged exposure or PE, cognitive processing therapy, CPT, or EMDR, which is eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, all of those treatments really rely on exposure at their core. So often the patient is asked to recount the trauma memory out loud. That's definitely one of the core components of prolonged exposure, where patients are asked to talk about their trauma, recount the trauma memory repeatedly over and over and over again until they feel more comfortable talking about it. And then cognitive processing therapy goes about exposure in a different way, where it's really talking about how the patient's belief systems have been changed by the trauma. So talking about the ways in which those worldviews have been shifted and how they can make more sense of the trauma that way. And then all of them also focus on in vivo exposure. So that's in-life exposure, where we're asking patients to confront those situations, activities, or people that they've been avoiding because they feel unsafe while doing them. And that just helps to make their world larger and larger, and they can take back their life for PTSD. It's interesting. I'm working with a client right now who, she has really severe PTSD and as a result of a sexual assault. And I've just been so impressed with her engagement in the PTSD work. We're doing prolonged exposure. Like, she was very, very hesitant to do the trauma recounting, the imaginal exposure, but she's come such a long way. And so I just have so much faith in these treatments to help people feel better, and to take back their lives and to feel more comfortable in them.
Do you, in your practice, like sometimes choose between doing PE and CPT with someone?
I do. I give people the option. I explain both of the treatments, which both have really strong evidence bases backing them. And I found that a lot of people who've had sexual assault histories or a long history of, childhood sexual abuse are more likely to want to go the CPT route. And I think it makes good sense. Like, just the idea of having to recount like the most horrible thing that's happened to them in their lives is not what they want to do. And they're more easily kind of convinced by us taking a less, what would be the word for it? Kind of a less in your face way of exposing themselves to the trauma.
And I would imagine if you've had such a complex trauma history, isn't PE sort of about integrating a trauma into your existing worldview that is like presumed to already be kind of healthy? Whereas if you have a long trauma history, your worldview might already be kind of affected by that.
Exactly. And I think people who've had childhood abuse in particular, like, often that impacts them on a developmental level, right? It impacts like how they view themselves in the world. It affects like their attachments to people, caregivers in their lives. And so I think it makes more sense for us to go the tack of talking about like, how has this impacted their belief system, rather than like choosing one of the many traumatic events that has happened to them and focusing on that and hoping that it generalizes to the others. So I found that particularly women who've experienced those childhood sexual abuse or sexual assaults are more likely pick the CPT route. But I found both to be pretty effective in my practice for helping folks with PTSD. I think it's just a matter of what people are willing to engage in. I mean, these treatments are hard, and there's quite a bit of dropout. And so if you can help inoculate people and let them know, like, this is going to be really hard. And what we find is that sometimes PTSD symptoms will go up in the middle of treatment, but they typically go down if you stick with it. Then people are more likely to stick around and see it through to the end.
Psychoeducation is definitely so important.
It's really, really important. I'm really struck in my practice of how many people have been given a diagnosis but haven't been told like what that means, what the patterns of symptoms are, and just how normalizing and validating it can be for them to hear like, oh, there's a name for what I'm experiencing and there's a treatment for it. And I just feel like it's such a dereliction of duty for clinicians not to do that more often with people when they give a diagnosis, to provide some psychoeducation about what that means and how clients can get treatment for it.